Are you ready to be the change? If so, you've come to the right place. You are about to join a movement of entrepreneurs who are empowering people, saving the planet, and turning their passion into profits while creating the lifestyle of their dreams. If you don't believe us, check out our website at entrepreneursforchange.com, a place where you can be inspired, mentored, and supported by a tribe of change-making entrepreneurs just like you. Now, before diving into the interview, I want to encourage you to rate, review, and download Entrepreneurs for a Change on iTunes. This really helps us reach more people with inspiring stories of entrepreneurs who are changing the world. Also, if these stories inspire you to start a world-changing business of your own, head over to our website at entrepreneursforchange.com and download the Business Changemakers Toolkit to get a jumpstart today. Now on to the show. Hello, amazing changemakers, and I'm here today, very, very excited to bring to you my guest, Daniel J. Lewis, who has been a bit of a mentor to me in my journey in podcasting. So Daniel is an award-winning podcaster, and he helps others launch and improve their own podcasts, as well as to share their passions and find success through podcasting. So he's created a number of training resources and podcasting tools, and he also offers one-on-one consulting, as well as speaks about podcasting, social media, and WordPress. And Daniel has hosted a network of award-nominated shows at Noodle.mx, covering how to podcast, as well as clean comedy, and the number one unofficial podcast for ABC's hit drama Once Upon a Time. So in my journey of podcasting, Daniel's blog, which is chock full of fantastic information, has really helped guide me through this process. And he's also been really helpful to me answering my late night tweets in pretty good time. So thank you so much, Daniel, for all your help. And I'd love to ask you how you got started with your podcasting business and who exactly do you work with?
Thank you, Lorna. Well, I work with anyone who wants to get podcasting as part of their hobby or as part of their success, and however they define that. And when I started podcasting, I didn't have ideas of grandeur or of making a business of this. It really started with when Apple released iTunes 4.9 in 2005. And that was the version where they added the podcast feature into it. And I heard my boss at the organization where I worked at that time told me that I could find content and listen to it for free. And I thought, well, that sounds cool. So I looked up technology and I found This Week in Tech and a couple other podcasts and listened to them. And I realized that I could do this. I know how to edit audio. I know how to create WordPress websites. I kind of know how to work with an RSS feed. I'm familiar with some audio microphone techniques and such. And I saw a model of how I could do my clean comedy, which was my original podcast, the Ramen Noodle Clean Comedy, which I still host today. I saw a model for how I could do that, and I started that then in 2007. But it took me 2 years to release 9 full episodes because I was trying to be a perfectionist. So I didn't really start taking podcasting seriously until 2009.
I understand how that can be. When I first got started podcasting, I tried to do everything myself, and it really took me about 1.5 years until I actually finally launched my podcast. So, there can be a lot of technical details and nuances to understanding how to podcast successfully, which I'm excited to talk to you about today. So let me just kind of rewind a little bit. And so when you started getting into podcasting, you actually had a job, and is now what you do as a consultant for podcasting. Is that your full-time job, or how does it work?
Right. I was working full-time back then as a designer, and I fulfilled many different design roles within a single organization: presentation, web design, print design, and such. And I started the podcast while I was there. Eventually, after I'd accomplished every goal I had in that organization, even the goals that seemed impossible to accomplish, I was kind of in this limbo area where I didn't have any other goals within the company, didn't know where else I could go, wasn't sure what to do, was kind of suffering from some burnout here and there. And around that time is when a couple things happened. One, I was engaged to my now wife, Jenny, and I also launched the Audacity to Podcast, which is the show I now host that teaches people how to launch and improve their own podcasts. That was in 2010. And around that time, I was talking with my fiance, and she challenged me, how about I set a goal that 1 year from then, I would be completely full-time self-employed. I thought, that's great. I'll go ahead and set that goal. But I didn't know how I would actually reach that goal. That's when I launched the Audacity to Podcast, just feeling like I have something to say about the podcasting industry. I have experience to bring that others aren't bringing. But when I saw the success that it was receiving and the number of people contacting me, asking to hire me for my help to get them into podcasting, I realized this is that missing piece where I could start my business, which back then I was thinking a web design business. I would start that design business and then be able to promote it through my podcast to other podcasters. And that's how then I did launch 1 year later, full-time self-employed in June 2011. And it's been growing and changing ever since then.
Wow, fantastic. So podcasting actually created a whole new business and career for you. So that's very, very exciting to know. Now, I'd love to find out, since there's been a real explosion around podcasting, how can podcasting actually help a person grow their business? So I can understand that you've taken your expertise with podcasting and now you teach others how to podcast. But let's say if you took another aspiring entrepreneur who had an interest in a particular area but didn't want to teach about podcasting, how could they leverage podcasting to grow their business?
Well, you have to look at what is relevant. So if you are trying to build a business around video games and your podcast is about basket weaving, it's not going to connect very well. They're not relevant to each other. So you have to come up with something that's relevant and that you are passionate enough to talk about, even when no one is listening. Because when you start your podcast, nobody is listening. We all start with 0 audience members. So turning it into a business all depends on how you want to approach this content creation. The amazing thing about podcasting is that it gives you an opportunity to establish yourself as an authority in the space. If you have a blog, yes, you can establish yourself as an authority that way, but what you have in a blog is a less personal interaction with your audience. People could be coming, reading, they don't hear your actual voice, they don't see your face, and your blog posts could be heavily edited. You can edit them to the point that they are worded perfectly and beautifully, Pulitzer Prize winning blog posts. But in a podcast, where it's either audio or video, people are hearing and seeing you use your actual voice, your real words. And while you can do some editing, especially in audio, you can do some editing to cover up certain mistakes, like saying too much, or you trailed off and you wanted to edit out a certain section. The main thing that people are getting is they can see how well you understand the information, how passionately you present it, and how clearly you can communicate that information, which shows your expertise much more than just writing. So people begin to know, like, and trust you because of the information you're freely giving out and giving out really professionally, really well. So that then when you have a business behind your podcast, and it could be a product, a service, consulting, affiliates, podcast sponsorships, there are many different ways to make money with a podcast. But when you pursue these things, then people will take action on them because they know, like, and trust you.
So Daniel, why launch a podcast? What are the benefits?
Well, you're establishing yourself as an authority when you present the information and communicate it very clearly in a way that's more passionate than just writing information. But also, having a podcast gives your audience or potential audience a new way of consuming your content. There are many great podcasters out there who have also been writers and bloggers, but they've said things like they've received more of their audience because of their podcast than because of their blog. And people can relate with a podcast much more. They can consume it much more easily. Like, I listen to podcasts while I'm working, while I'm mowing the yard, while I'm driving, and these are all audio podcasts. I can't read a book or read a blog post in all of those cases. And many people also will be listening to a podcast while they are working in their dead-end job, absolutely hating their day, but your podcast could be the bright spot in their day, that they look forward to that day that you release an episode so that they can consume your content. So you're building stronger relationships with people because they are carrying your voice with them wherever they go, sometimes where no other human can go.
Definitely. I have to agree. There were many moments where I would listen to the Tropical MBA podcast from my cube for my corporate job, and it just gave me the will to live. So I totally hear you on that. So, okay. So let's say, we have an aspiring podcaster. How do you go about choosing the topic to podcast about? So, for example, when we see someone who is like a podcasting phenomenon, like John Lee Dumas, and he just basically came out of left field, produced a single podcast every day about entrepreneurship. He amassed a huge audience. He produced a lot of content, but entrepreneurship is really broad, and yet somehow that worked really well for him. So I'm curious to know whether, not all of us can come, and become podcast machines like he was. But at the same time, I think the difficult thing to know is like, how broad of a topic do you cover, or how much do you niche down to cover the interests of a specific demographic? What are your thoughts on that? Broad or niche?
There are two sides to it. The broad side is getting very congested in the podcasting space. Like if you just have a general technology show, you're going to be up against competition like This Week in Tech and so many other very broad, very big podcasts. So the broader you are, the bigger the competition is and the harder you'll have growing an audience for that. And if you grow an audience, you'll have a harder time getting them to take action on things. So if you have an audience of 20,000 people, maybe only 100 of those people would actually take action on something. It's kind of like the billboard approach where thousands of people are driving by a billboard. Very few of them actually care enough to take action on what they see from that billboard. So when you are picking a niche, try to focus in more on that niche. Instead of just a technology show, maybe focus on a particular kind of technology, like home technology or entertainment technology or health technology or video gaming technology, or niche down even further. Like if you have a video game podcast, you could talk specifically about fantasy games on the Xbox One, and that be your specific niche. When you niche down like that, you build a much more passionate following that also takes action more when you give relevant calls to action within your content. And that would be the kind of stuff that actually makes you money. Like getting a sponsor, and you get if it's a relevant sponsor, you get your audience to go visit that sponsor, try their product, or you create a product or service yourself that appeals to this niche audience. So you'll have actually a better success with a niche audience, even though you'll probably have smaller numbers.
So what about if you're dealing with a particular audience demographic that has specific interests that could easily be split off into different podcasts? So for example, I have this desire to launch a new podcast that's oriented towards a demographic of people that really enjoy going to Burning Man. So you've got an interest in mind expansion and brain and body hacking, and then you've got an interest in alternative lifestyles and relationships, and an interest in sustainability and technology. So I'm trying to figure out, does that end up being 3 podcasts, or could it be under the banner of 1? What are your thoughts on that? Because demographics are harder to kind of nail down rather than just like one specific, product type, like fantasy Xbox games, for example.
Right. You really need to know your audience and know whether it would fit better for you to split these things off into separate sites and separate podcasts. For example, we have the podcast about the TV show Once Upon a Time, and the channel ABC did a spin-off series that was a short-run spin-off series called Once Upon a Time in Wonderland. We knew all of our audience would probably be interested in that spin-off, but we also knew that not all of our audience would actually watch the spin-off. So what we did is we would regularly cross-promote our other podcast, but we created an additional podcast to appeal to the same audience because the content was relevant enough and connected enough. We did host it on the same website, just under different categories. But if you have more broad, separate interests, then it might serve you better to create completely separate podcasts. That way you can optimize each of those podcasts for specifically that content that you want to share and not trying to blend everything together and be the ultimate podcast, but you have these separate niche podcasts and then you can have crossover. And by having more podcasts, you also have more opportunities for creating niche products and services or get niche sponsors for each of those and having, in a way, multiple streams of income, diversifying your talents and your content and your expertise.
Wow. Okay. So I'm really excited about the monetization conversation that we're going to have during our masterclass, which you can get from the show notes. But going back to the idea of creating multiple or different podcasts, but hosted on the same site. So in your scenario with Once Upon a Time, you have the spinoff and then you have the actual, your original podcast. And they're both just separate podcasts, but different categories on the same website.
Right. Yeah. So that way it's reaching the same audience, and it makes perfect sense that way because the two TV shows are designed for the same audience. But if I have completely separate topics, like I have the Audacity podcast, which is about podcasting, and the Ramen Noodle, which is a clean comedy podcast, they make better sense to be on completely separate sites. So that way I can do the search engine optimization for each site. I can do the marketing for each site, the branding, the style, the content, everything there fits with each particular site. With my Once Upon a Time and Wonderland example, though, there's so much crossover that they did fit best on the same site, but separate podcasts.
That's very, very good advice. Thank you. Okay. So once you have your topic, I know there's a lot of obsession with trying to hit the new and noteworthy list. So do you have any strategies that you recommend? You know, let's say you're just starting off and, you don't have a website that already gets a lot of traffic. You don't have an email list. Does that person have any chance at all in being able to hit new and noteworthy when they're just starting off from scratch?
Definitely. You have a chance because we all start from zero. But first, think about, do you really need or want to be new and noteworthy? It is a nice boost. One thing that you need to understand is that new and noteworthy is actually two lists combined. One is a list of new podcasts and the other is noteworthy podcasts. I've been in new and noteworthy twice before with old podcasts. And yes, each time I see a nice little bump, but when you first start out, you'll see a big spike and you will see a drop off after that. So almost don't pay attention to your numbers at all while you're in new and noteworthy. But the most important thing for you to do is right from the beginning, regardless of whether you make it into new and noteworthy, is to have great content that engages with your audience, gives them helpful or entertaining information, and relates with them in some way, and then give them a call to action to help you out. And the way that you can help get into new and noteworthy or featured in other ways, or just simply rank higher in iTunes. The most important parts of that within iTunes as a podcast directory is get people to go into iTunes and click subscribe. They need to rate your podcast. That is leaving a 1 to 5 star rating, as well as write reviews for your podcast. The written reviews are very valuable. That's why I've created a service over at mypodcastreviews.com that automatically emails you your reviews. And when you sign up, you also get a list of 7 ways to get more reviews for your podcast. But because when you know what your reviews are, then you can thank people for those reviews. And people love hearing their names mentioned by people they respect. So when people hear that you mentioned someone who reviewed you, then other people will want to leave reviews for you, which helps grow your podcast. And it's also really encouraging to see what people think of your show.
Okay, so this is interesting because, in this fantastic blog post that John Lee Dumas wrote. I think it was called "The Ultimate Guide to Podcasting." I'll include the links in the link in the show notes. But he does mention that the best way to ask people for reviews is at the right time and the right place. So when people are tweeting, when people tweet you, email you, or Facebook message you, thanking you for the show, for example. So that's what he did when people would reach out to him online, thank him for the show. He'd just reply back and say, "Hey, we'd really appreciate a review," and he'd send over a URL. It was a pretty URL with a link to the show. Now, given that most people are listening to your podcast while they're shopping for groceries or in their car or in their, soul leeching job, how do you get them to take that action? Because, there's the fact that they're actually listening to your podcast and not in front of the computer. And then when they are in front of the computer, but then they may not be listening to your podcast. So, if you don't get the response that John Lee Dumas, was getting, like if you don't have an email list to, email people to ask for reviews, if you're not getting people tweeting you or Facebook messaging you, then how do you get them to review straight off your podcast? Do you have any recommendations on how to inspire people to take action?
It really is about asking at the right time and at the right place, because people don't want to hear you start your podcast asking them to do something, giving you money, leaving you ratings or reviews. You need to give them your content first. You hook them with your content. And in fact, that's how most people get into subscribing to a podcast, is they like the content first. Then they like the personality. Then they will feel like they need to reciprocate in some way. And so that's why if you want your audience to do something, you need to ask for it at the end of your content, after you've already gained their trust. And the best way to do this is make it easy, simple, and memorable for your audience. I ask people, go to theaudacitytopodcast.com/iTunes. I make a very friendly link like that, as well as for my show notes. And I try not to give a lot of URLs, because the more URLs I share in my episode, the less people will remember it. So I just tell them, go to the show notes, and I give them a very specific, easy to remember URL for that. And for something like iTunes, I can say, go to theaudacitypodcast.com/iTunes. And also I have those links very prominently on the website. So everything is linked from the website. So it really doesn't matter what page they go to on the website. They see certain calls to action. But in my podcast, I make it very easy for them to remember by making it simple.
Okay. So you make the ask only at the end. You don't pepper your podcast with mentions of where you can rate and review. Because I've listened to podcasts where the first thing that they ask for is like, "Hey, if you like this, rate and review." And then there's another ask, and then there's another ask. So do you recommend then just making one ask at the end?
Right. At the end, near the end, maybe in the middle. And it depends on how many things you need to ask your audience to do. Like in my Once Upon a Time podcast, sometimes we have a sponsor. We always have donations. We always have people to thank for reviews, and we always want to ask for feedback. So that's potentially 4 calls to action in our podcast. And the way that I do that is I spread it out through the podcast in our longer episodes, which for that show are sometimes around an hour and a half of content. So I spread it out throughout there, not asking them all to do it all at once, but spread it out. Thank the sponsor at one point, thank our donators at another point, and give a link to donate. And it's after, though, we've already given content, established a relationship of some sort. Give value first, and then your audience will feel like reciprocating and giving value back to you.
Got it. Okay. So the biggest challenge for many new podcasters is getting their downloads from the hundreds to the thousands. So, you mentioned earlier that, okay, if you make it to the new and noteworthy, you might get a bump in subscriptions and downloads, but then that tends to drop. So are there any strategies that you recommend to keep the downloads and the subscriptions increasing? How would you promote your podcast?
Well, before you work on promotion, you really need to make sure that you have something worth promoting. So I talk about 4 areas of quality. 3 of them have to do with your podcast. The first area is your content. Is your content good enough, engaging enough, helpful enough, entertaining enough that people will want to share it? Second is your presentation of that content, clear, concise, understandable, engaging. Third is your production, enhancing the presentation, which is enhancing the content instead of distracting from it. Because you can have overly produced content and you can have underproduced content where it's very hard to enjoy it because the noise is so bad or the quality is too distracting, anything like that. So those 3 areas of focus in your quality, your content, your presentation, and your production, when you have those well, then you're not fighting against yourself to promote. So that's when your promotion quality can come in because each of these build on each other. So when you have something that's worth promoting, the best way to grow your audience is with relationships and word of mouth. With relationships, that is engaging with your audience as much as you can. Try to reply to their comments, their tweets, their emails. It's not entirely scalable, but that's okay while you still can do what you can do. While you still have a small audience of hundreds of listeners or maybe thousands, the low thousands. If you can engage with people, do it. Show them that you care. At a point, yes, you'll outgrow that, but that's okay for later on. Do what you can now. Try to know something about these people. Build relationships. The other thing to leverage is word of mouth. This is the way that most podcasters learn about other podcasts is they hear someone mention it. And in fact, that's how most people get into podcasts is they hear someone else say something about podcasts. So find a way that you can leverage word of mouth, either empowering and equipping your own audience to spread the word about you. That is with social sharing buttons on your website or emails, something that's actionable that your audience can do. Sometimes it's even just asking your audience, hey, please go to the website and click the tweet button on this episode to show us that you like this. When you ask people to do something for you after you've already provided them value, they will love to do that for you, especially if it doesn't cost them anything. They will love to show their support. The other way you can leverage word of mouth is by interviewing other people or having guests on your show and then getting them to talk about their appearance on your show. Like I'm going to do with this discussion that we've had is that after this publishes, I'll share it with my audience. So some of my audience will come over and they'll probably stick around and decide, hey, this is great content. I want to stay subscribed to this podcast. The other thing is being interviewed on other shows. I know some of your audience will come over to my show after hearing me here on Entrepreneurs for a Change, and they'll decide, hey, that guy sounds cool, fun, exciting, whatever. I want to see what else he does. So word of mouth is your most powerful way of getting more people to your podcast, and word of mouth is built on relationships.
So if you were to dial back your experience of podcasting, was there a while where you felt like you were just talking to avoid, or was there a point where you saw your interest in your podcast hockey stick and just really spike?
Oh yeah, it was the early stage for me where I just wasn't taking it seriously. I wasn't trying to produce high quality content, or I was trying too hard and being too perfectionist. And I wasn't working well on building relationships with people. I was in some ways focusing too much on the numbers. And later on, then I look at my numbers and then it surprises me to see, whoa, I'm higher than I thought I was. It's really about focusing on building those relationships, getting that word of mouth, not so much focusing on the actual numbers. In fact, I recommend don't check your numbers every day. Wait a few weeks before you check your stats for a particular episode. And that way you can see and be surprised that, yes, your audience is growing and you're most importantly building relationships with people.
Yeah, I think that's a really good point that you're making too, because I know for a fact that a lot of podcasters are kind of obsessed with getting 1 million downloads to their podcast. And so, part of my quest has been, oh my God, how do I reach 1 million downloads? And it's kind of interesting when you mention, that the juxtaposition between the stats and then the actual power of the relationships that you're building with your podcast. Because for me, those relationships have just been so valuable, so important. Podcasting has for me been a bit like networking on steroids. But I'm curious about your thoughts on reaching 1 million downloads, because I know you've reached you've reached several million downloads already. So what are your thoughts on how we might be able to achieve that, or whether we should even obsess?
Well, when you look at it with a plain number like that, there are so many ways that you can get to that number. I'll let you in on a little secret here. You could just make 1 million podcast episodes and get one person to download all of those episodes, and boom, you hit 1 million downloads. So that's an exaggeration, but that's really true. That's how you can, in a way, game the system. This is why I wrote a blog post about don't believe the myth of monthly downloads or weekly downloads or daily downloads, because it's really quite meaningless. The more episodes you have in your archive and the more frequently you release episodes, the more downloads you'll have in a time period. So that number is really kind of meaningless. But if you want to get to a bigger number, then just release more content. That's an easy way to get there. But what you should really be looking at would be your downloads per episode. After about a month, at least 4 weeks, that gives you an impression of how big your audience actually is. So if you see that each download, or you see that each episode receives 500 downloads after about 4 weeks, then you know you have about 500 people listening to you. And the thing that you should never say is the word only. Oh, I only have 100 people downloading my episodes. Well, think about it. That's 100 people coming back week after week, or maybe even day after day, listening to you, valuing your opinions, your perspective. You can change the world with just 100 people. So don't think of it as only 100 people. Think of it as you are speaking to an audience, a faithful audience who cares about you, cares about your content, and they are coming back time after time. So build your relationships with them and find ways to serve their needs more. So if you want to increase your downloads or grow your audience from hundreds to thousands or to millions, you could look at doing things like simply releasing more content, but especially look at the content that people want. You really need to know your audience or your potential audience for this. And then find content that you can create for them. Like I did as a test a while back. I did some search engine research and discovered that a particular keyword was very popular in search engines related with podcasting. So I created an episode. This was a test. I created an episode all about that topic that people were searching heavily for. I named it that. I search engine optimized my post and all of this stuff. I didn't do any black hat techniques or weird backlinking or anything like that. I just created quality content. That episode is my most downloaded episode because I sought to be helpful with that. And I know that episode contributed to bringing more people faithfully back to my podcast.
I really like the way you reframed that. Thank you so much. Regarding the question around rebranding and relaunching podcasts, I know this has come up for the Tropical MBA folks, because I know that previously it was Dan's podcast, and now they're TMBA, and so it's kind of interesting when I looked at why they did that, and how they were able to, and what they were able to do within iTunes. It didn't seem like they could really do much. So I'm curious to know from your perspective, why would anyone want to rebrand or relaunch a podcast?
When you would want to consider this would be when it actually makes sense. And yeah, that's kind of a roundabout answer. You have to figure out Are you talking about the same content, or are you just doing a name change or a visual change, anything like that? If you're doing that, then I don't think you should relaunch your podcast. Certainly don't relaunch just to try and get in new and noteworthy. That's not a good way to do it. That would be like a restaurant owner having another grand opening because they weren't happy with the turnout for their first grand opening. It's not a good way to go. But there are those times where, as you go on, you decide, okay, I'm finished talking about this or approaching it from this particular perspective. That's when you could consider retiring that podcast, leave it available so everyone can download it, and start a new podcast about a different subject. You could change your approach and make it more seasonal, where you have season 1, season 2, season 3. That often gives you the privilege of being able to revisit old content, but you revisit it from a new perspective. Like I recently did a series where I was challenging the podcasting assumptions. That could have been a season for the Audacity to Podcast. And I could have a season that's all about the basics, a season that's all about live streaming, a season that's all about video, a season that's all about audio, stuff like that. I could do it that way, but I prefer to just go weekly, every single week. So you really have to look at what kind of rebranding are you doing? If it's just slapping a new label or a new design or new music or something like that on your podcast, then you shouldn't relaunch it. But if you've been gone for a while and you're completely changing your approach, you have new hosts, you're talking about new content, then really you have a separate show.
Okay. Because I know the changing the RSS feed can be kind of a hassle. And so if one wanted to rename their podcast and just, have a new name and a new graphic, you could certainly do that within your existing podcast. It would simply have the old RSS feed. But you could still just rebrand within the same show.
Exactly. Like with the Ramen Noodle, my clean comedy podcast, it used to be called just the Ramen Noodle, and no one searches iTunes for the Ramen Noodle. Now it's called the Ramen Noodle Clean Comedy, and people are searching for clean comedy. So I did a rebranding, and also it originally was about funny stories as a bachelor. Now I'm married, so I've changed the branding a bit, but we're still doing the same thing. We're still sharing funny stories and relating in a clean comedy way. So we didn't relaunch, but we did rebrand.
Okay, that's really good to know. Great. So we're coming to the end of this segment. I'd love to leave you with the last couple questions. First is, do you think the podcasting market is oversaturated these days, or do you think there's still opportunities to enter and profit?
I definitely think there are opportunities. Yes, it is saturated, but that's where you really need to niche down, focus on that particular area, a niche where you can dominate that niche. And maybe you won't have tens of thousands of downloads. Maybe you will, but there is still plenty of information to be gained, plenty of expertise. And here's the thing. You may have competition, but no one has your experience, your perspective, and your style. So it's okay to enter a niche that already has other podcasters in that niche, because you're bringing something else to the table, and look for ways that you can create community with those other podcasters instead of competing against them.
I really like that perspective. Thank you so much, Daniel. How can we best stay in touch with you?
The best place to go is theaudacitytopodcast.com. That links to my personal blog, my other podcast, my Twitter account, my email address. And also there on theaudacitytopodcast.com, I have a special podcasting pre-flight check sheet that you can go through before you press record on an episode to make sure that you get the best recording possible. And that's available free if you sign up for the newsletter. And that's all at theaudacitytopodcast.com.
Absolutely. Thank you so much. I have to say, guys, the amount of valuable information I've gotten from Audacity to Podcast has helped my podcast launch in so many ways. So if you're thinking about launching a podcast, definitely go and check Daniel's blog out first, and read up before you hit record and read up before you hit launch, because it'll make your life so much easier. Thank you, Daniel.
You're welcome, Lorna.
Thanks, folks, for listening to the Entrepreneurs for a Change podcast. If you enjoyed this episode, please help us reach more people with inspiring stories like this one by giving us a 5-star rating in iTunes. If this podcast inspires you to join the movement of change-making entrepreneurs, we'd love to give you a jumpstart with our free Business Changemakers Toolkit, which you can download at www.entrepreneursforachange.com/join. If you have a changemaker in mind you'd love for us to interview, go to entrepreneursforachange.com/suggest and tell us who and why. Finally, feel free to stop by facebook.com/entrepreneursforachange to share your thoughts and say hello.